Hello and welcome back. This is Chapter 11 on stress and health. So, this lecture video is going to be a little different because I'm going to spend most of the time talking about some of the good research-based fundamental skills that people can use to cope with stress and anxiety and depression. And so this is going to be a much more applied, practical lecture today. Before we get into that, there's a couple of things that I want you to be sure that you're clear on as you read through the chapter. All right. In section 11.1, I want you to be sure that you can distinguish the difference between stress and stressors, and what Selye talks about in terms of eustress and distress. In 11.2, be sure you can differentiate catastrophes from the idea of major life events versus hassles. In table 11.1 and 11.2, be aware of the SRRS and the CUSS. I don't take those ideas as gospel, but I think they're interesting and relevant to this topic of stress and health. In 11.3, I think it's helpful to make the distinction between the types of psychological stressors, right? Pressure, uncontrollability, frustration, and conflict. I think those are good things to know. And in 11.4, I especially like some of the physiological factors, this idea of the general adaptation syndrome, where they talk about the 3 stages: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. In 11.5, be sure you can define the terms allostasis and allostatic load. In 11.7, under the cognitive factors in stress, I like Lazarus's work on the cognitive mediational theory of emotion, especially where it talks about primary versus secondary appraisals. We're going to talk about another aspect of that today. In that same section, Jameson's work on the cognitive reappraisal approach, I think, is also interesting, as well as the Yerkes-Dodson law, which is figure 11.5. So just be familiar with those terms. In 11.8, you should at least be familiar with the idea of a type A versus a type B personality, also type C, type D personalities, and even the hardy personality, or type H. Seligman is also brought up again in this section, so be sure you can have a general idea of the difference between an optimistic versus a pessimistic outlook. In section 11.10, they shift gears and start talking about coping, and that's where I want to spend most of our time today. So to begin, understand that if you look at the difference between chronic stress, right, and occasional anxiety or anxiety attacks like panic attacks, some of the research actually suggests that chronic stress is probably worse on your health than occasional panic attacks. Your body is really wired pretty well to handle occasional anxiety situations. That's not a big deal in terms of the physiological impact over the long haul. But chronic stress, we're finding from the research, can have some pretty dramatic health effects, physical health effects over time. So that's really where we want to spend a lot of time, be sure that we manage stress well in our lives. So if you think about the ways that you or people around you typically deal with stress, one of the most common things people do is they avoid stress. They avoid the situation, they avoid triggers, they avoid trying to think about those things, or certainly they don't want to feel the same way that they feel when they're stressed. So one of the classic things that people do is to run from them, to avoid from them. Now, that makes a lot of sense, and it's very natural. And for immediate, real threats, it's the right thing to do. If you're walking down the street and there's a dog loose, a big dog who's barking and looks pretty mean, it's a good idea to avoid that dog if you can. However, what happens for a lot of us is that becomes our primary coping strategy for anything that is upsetting for us. And what we find is, in general, avoidance is not really a good long-term coping skill and can very often create more problems than it helps. So the things we're going to talk about today are alternatives to avoidance, alternatives to distractions, and it's going to fall primarily under two different categories: things that we can do differently and how we begin to think differently to help us deal with different kinds of stressors and difficulties in our lives. Okay? So let's begin with some fundamental things that you can do, and your friends can do, and your family can do, anyone can do, that help manage stress better than avoidance or just shutting down and try not to think about this stuff. And the things that you can do really fall into three, possibly four categories. The first thing we can do is regular exercise. We'll talk more about that. The second thing you can do is be sure that you stay connected well to your social support network. And number three, we want to be sure that you're staying active and busy with what we call purposeful and pleasurable activities. Purposeful activities is not necessarily fun things you do, but they're meaningful, important activities, whether that's work, school, taking care of your family, volunteering, things like that. So they're not necessarily fun, but they're really important to you. And pleasurable activities, things that you just do because you enjoy it. So when we find a good balance between staying active with things that are meaningful to us and things that are enjoyable and fun, that's a really good way to manage stress. So let's break those down a little bit more. So first of all, some of the research on exercise is really quite startling to me. I remember several years ago when I first read some studies about the benefits of regular exercise. They compared how effective exercise was in managing depression compared to other things like a control group with doing nothing, or versus antidepressant medications, or even talking to a therapist, a psychologist, to get some help for depression. And what they found is when it comes to depression, that regular exercise is more helpful overall for more people than either taking antidepressant medications or seeing a therapist. Now, let this sink in for a second, okay? The research actually suggests if you had only one thing to do to help yourself feel better in terms of actual depression, you would be better off committing to a regular exercise routine than you would committing to medications that work really well and psychotherapy that works really, really well. So it's pretty amazing, actually, that the simplest thing out of all three of those is actually the thing that works the best. And what we're finding is the benefits for exercise aren't just for depression. It absolutely benefits anxiety, stress. It helps with sleep, all those kinds of things. So in at least one of the studies, what they meant by exercise was simply committing to 5 days a week. 5 days a week, 30 to 45 minutes of walking. Now, the research seems to indicate that it doesn't matter if you're walking or jogging or riding a bike or on the treadmill, things like that. But the cardio types of exercise was the type of exercise that they were looking at. So doing weightlifting and other kinds of strength exercises would probably help as well, but most of the research was based on cardio exercise. Okay? So for the studies, the rule of thumb would be 3 to 5 days a week, 30 to 45 minutes of some type of exercise, and walking absolutely counts. Okay? So I really, really like that idea. All right, number 2 is staying socially connected to the people around you. There's lots of research about this. If you remember a couple of chapters ago, there were I think because Harlow did the study with the monkeys, right? We are just wired to be social creatures. None of us do well when we're quote unquote lone wolves. One of the things that happens when we get stressed out, when we get overwhelmed, is we want to pull back, right? And there's lots of reasons for this. We're very concerned about how they perceive us. We don't want to be seen as weak. We don't want to cry in front of other people. And very often in time, we don't even want to be a burden to people. But the truth of the matter is, We simply do better, we cope better when we can get outside of our own head and connect with the people around us. Now, during this pandemic, it's exceptionally difficult to do that. But all of the research says we do better in terms of depression, anxiety, stress, even in terms of if you look at research on who are the people in the world who are most content and happy in their lives. And one of the correlations we find is those people have good, regular interactions with their social support network, people who are important to them. Okay, so that having that open expression, being able to laugh with your friends, being able to cry with your friends, that stuff has a profound impact. One of the things I find is when people get depressed, when they get anxious, when they get stressed out, a lot of people, they just want to pull back. It's very natural. It's just not very helpful, right? So it's important to understand that we need to fight that urge and stay connected with the people around us. Number 3, purposeful and pleasurable activity. If you think about what happens when we get overwhelmed, when we get really stressed out, when we get really depressed, it's exhausting. It's emotionally exhausting, it's mentally exhausting, and it's physically exhausting. It saps all of our strength, all of our energy, all of our motivation to want to get up and do the normal things we do. But what happens is when we start falling into a habit, a routine where we are just disengaged from the world and disengaged from the normal things that we do to cope, that's when we get into trouble. So it's very, very common to just stop exercise and stop connecting with people, stop our normal hobbies and interests, stop working, stop studying for class, even doing the normal chores we do around the house. All those things tend to suffer. If you're noticing that stuff happens to you, because it happens to everybody, it's very, very common, it can be really helpful to get back on track with your normal, regular activities. Again, in 2 areas: purposeful, pleasurable activities. So, the big 3 here: exercise, socialize, purposeful and pleasurable activities. Those things really make a difference. Now, for some of you, when you get overwhelmed and stressed out, you don't get less active. You actually start to ramp up, right? Because some people, that's one of the ways they cope. They stay busy, 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 so they don't have to think too much. They don't have to feel too much because they're afraid that once they slow down, that's when all these worries and fears and other negative thoughts are just going to come back in. So in those situations, you still want to do those first 3 things: exercise, socialize, stay busy and active. But you also need to make sure that you're taking time to really slow down and give your brain and your emotions a chance to recharge their batteries. Okay, you might want to think about meditation or mindfulness, which is mentioned in the chapter, right? If prayer is your thing, you might really slow down, listen to some good music, read a book for pleasure. Imagine that, right? For a lot of people, if you're the kind of person who's just a go-getter, you might really need to find a different kind of balance and not worrying about being more busy, but actually slow down so that you can recharge. So those are some things that you can do to help with stress, anxiety, and depression. But you can also change how you think about the stressors. We're going to come back to this same idea in later chapters, but I just want to introduce you to a simple cognitive model that they came up with probably 50, 60 years ago, and it's good stuff. This is a cognitive model, and the way to remember it is A plus B equals C. It's basic algebra. Here's how this works. A in this model stands for the activating event. In relation to this whole stress chapter, this would be a stressor, something that happens around you in your life that has the potential to trigger stress. Okay, so that's A, the activating event. Now B stands for beliefs. Now beliefs aren't just hardcore beliefs, but it's your beliefs, it's your interpretation, it's how you make sense of what just happened in A. So it's how you interpret A. B is how you make sense, your beliefs about A. So C, which stands for the emotional consequence, how you feel, is the result of the stressor that happens to you and how you interpret the stressor. In life, Your interpretation, that B section, that middle section, is crucial. In fact, I would argue it's even more important than the actual thing that happens to you in shaping how you are going to ultimately respond to that event. We've talked about this in past chapters. How you label an event defines what it means to you. It's that B section where you want to put most of your attention, because that is going to give context and meaning to the A, to the event, to help shape how you feel about it. All right? So let me give you just a small example of this. Years and years and years ago, in fact, I was in high school, and at the time I was working as a junior counselor up at one of the camps up at Sequoia National Park, and it was the weekend. So my brother and his girlfriend, they were in a 1979 black and yellow Bumblebee Camaro. It was beautiful, beautiful car. I love that car. And so they went up the mountains to pick us up. So we're coming down and we're on the 99, and I'm in the back seat. I'm minding my own business, and all of a sudden, the car just starts spinning this way and this way. And what we found out later was the tire, the actual wheel of the car actually just fell off. Apparently, whatever recent work that was done to it, the bolts weren't screwed on properly. So the wheel literally fell off. And so we're going highway speeds and we're just spinning this way and that way. And it would happen so quick. It was so surprising. I didn't even have a chance to be scared. I remember just putting my arms up, just waiting for the impact. Now, thankfully, that didn't happen. And so the car comes to a stop. Nobody hits us. Everybody's okay. I remember getting out of the car, and my first thought was, man, this is such a drag. Nice Camaro. Wasn't mine, of course, but nice Camaro. This was, could have been a horrible accident. It was quite scary. And then I remember looking up the 99, and about 50 yards in front of us was the highway narrowed, and there were some rails that were a lot closer to the road. And it occurred to me that had the wheel fell off even 3 seconds later, we would have started spinning and careened and got T-boned right into that railing. And it was at that moment that I thought, wow, this awful, terrible accident that just happened to us could have been so much worse. So much worse. And I remember actually being really thankful in that moment, because we could have died, or at least somebody in that car would have been seriously injured, right? So in this model, if you think about the activating event, the stressor was the wheel comes off and, we're sliding along the highway. The original belief was, oh my gosh, this is awful. We almost died, right? Poor car. But then when we're able to look at that second thought and look at it from the perspective of, wow, it could have been so much worse. We actually could have been seriously injured or died. We were lucky that nothing happened to us. That was enough to change the mood from this is a worst thing that could have happened to us that day to, wow, this was one of the best things that could have happened to us. Does that make sense? So in this model, this A plus B equals C, what we're looking for is we want to put our attention on this B. And what happens is, initially, if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, stressed out, worried, feeling like you're a failure, some of those kinds of things, almost always it's because that B section, that our belief, is not very accurate. It's twisted, it's distorted. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to step back and look for a more accurate and functional interpretation of what just happened. And by functional, I mean something that helps you deal with this better. We want it to be true, and we want it to be helpful. One last example of this. I have a friend, and she, for a living, she works with databases. Her company has contracts with the military and other companies who build big planes and things. And so she tells me that whenever her team is sitting down at the table to design a database for their project, they have a very specific way that they go about and do it. So they'll sit around the table and they'll say, okay, here's the problem that that we need to solve. And so they take suggestions. And when somebody comes up with a really good suggestion of how to write a database, they say, that's great. And then they write that down. Okay. Now, here's what they do next that is really interesting to me that I think all of us need to practice more. They never stop with just the first good idea. After they get one good idea, they say, that's great. Now let's generate 2 more possible approaches to this. And they'll sit down at the table till they come up with at least 3 good ideas, at least 3 ways to think about how to approach the problem that they're trying to solve. When they come up with 3, then they stop, and then they all talk about which one makes most sense. They choose the option that gives them the best odds of solving the problem, and then they go with that. Now compare that to how most of us approach problems in our own lives, right? We talked in previous lectures, I think from Kahneman, when we talked about the fast versus slow thinking, right? Our brain, the fast thinking part of our brain, doesn't want to take the time to generate multiple options. For our fast thinking, we tend to take the first option that kind of sort of makes some sense to us. So the problem is when we're stressed, when we're overwhelmed, when we're anxious, when we're depressed, the first option we have tends to be distorted, not very accurate, based out of fear, and is not usually a good, helpful way for us to see the situation. So we have to intentionally step back and look for another, more accurate, more helpful way to view the situation. There's lots of applications for this idea, lots of applications, not just for stress and anxiety and depression, but even for being a student, being a parent, being at work, just living our lives. All right, so that's the lecture for this week. Remember, you have quizzes in Revel. You have a chapter quiz in Revel. Don't forget those. You have a Canvas exam, which is different, and you've got your discussion board. So pay attention to all those things. Get your work in early. My office hours are Tuesday nights, 7 o'clock, and in the announcements is the link for that Zoom office hours. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to shoot me an email, and we'll work through whatever we need to. All right? Enjoy your work. See you soon. Bye-bye.